Hello and welcome to the second webinar in Building People's a second series of EDI Briefings sponsored by Planning Portal. This series is all about women. This specific episode is all about women, gender and caring. The whole series is how do we talk about diversity? So different dimensions and shared elements of experience. And to be clear, when we're talking about women, we mean all those who identify with that term. And gender is about the cultural experience of women. Trans lives is something that we'll be discussing in another webinar. It's really important to frame these sessions as part of the knowledge gathering that you might do as you try to figure out ways forward in your equity, diversity and inclusion work. And there are two things to remember. The first is representation matters, but it's not everything, because not everyone from a particular group is the same. There's a lot of diversity within a described group. Also, inclusion isn't about other people and their identities, cultural characteristics. It's about us and our behaviours. So how do we respect, value and support difference, however someone identifies? So we'll be providing some insight around that too. We are incredibly lucky and I'm so delighted to have these panelists with us today, Sue Brown and Kath Moore. I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves and we can hear a little bit more about them and the work that they do in this space. So first of all, if I can invite Sue to share who are you and where do you come from and what's your organisation all about?
Okay, Marsha, thanks very much. I mean, I'll do this. What I'd say now is if I go on too long, just shut me up, all right?
Okay, I'll do that.
Right, I'm Sue Brown. I'm the managing director of an organisation called Real Estate Balance. And I became managing director of Real Estate Balance, I always say, on April Fool's Day in the middle of a pandemic, which is genuinely true. So I became the managing director of Real Estate Balance on the 1st of April 2020. My background is, I mean, the accent gives it away. I'm London born and bred, even went to university in London. I've spent literally the last 40 years working in the real estate industry. For the most of that time, I was working in real estate comms, and that's what I did. And then a chap who, my husband and I ran our own business together for 28 years, or 19 years. We got bought out twice by large organisations, and a chap who we brought in to actually as the CEO of the last corporate organisation I worked for. My husband brought him in to be the CEO of that organisation. Actually, very generously sacked me at Christmas 2015 when I was 59 3/4. So they are a nice thing to happen. But as I say, I've been at REB for the last 3.5 years. REB was set up by 7 senior women working in the real estate industry in October 2015, who looked around them and thought, this isn't right. You know, there's very few senior women in the industry. We're going to do something about that. And they set up Real Estate Balance. It was for between 2015 and when I took over in 2020, it focused solely on gender. When I joined in 2020, I said to Liz Peace, who a lot of people, certainly in the property industry know, because she was chief exec of the British Property Federation for a number of years. I said to her, not come into this job just to replace white middle-class middle-aged men by white middle-class middle-aged women, that if I'm going to do this job, we've also got to look at issues around race and ethnicity and social mobility. And so that's now what we do. So we look at gender, we look at race and ethnicity, and we look at social mobility. And basically got 123 members from throughout the real estate industry, all of whom currently pay £2,950 a year to belong. We run a lot of events. You cannot join Real Estate Balance unless your chief exec signs up to our 10 CEO commitments, and we're just in the process of updating those as we speak. But I think probably more will come out as we go on. I'm probably aware that's probably long enough from me as an introduction.
Thank you, Sue. I was just about to go.
Give me the
Let's
red
give
light.
Kath a go.
Give me the red light. Yeah.
Kath, if we can hear from you, a little bit about you, a little bit about your organisation, and thank you for joining.
Great. Thank you for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to be part of the discussion here. I'm Kath Moore. I trained as a carpenter when I was 19 and worked on site for several years before then running my own company and going into teaching carpentry. And when I was working on site, I was always the only woman. And then when I went into teaching, I found that I would be teaching a class of mainly young men with 1 or 2 women. And the women would do really well, but at the end of the course, the men always got the jobs and the women never did, which I found really quite dispiriting. And then a friend came to me and said, oh, there's an opportunity that you might be interested in to set up a project to support women in the construction industry on the Olympic build. So this was 2008. And I jumped at the chance to do that. I thought about time someone actually recognised that women are really keen to get into this industry, but are really struggling to be accepted. And what they need is a little bit of extra support. So over I went to the Olympics then, and we set up Women into Construction, first of all, as a project. We've since morphed from there. So that was 15 years ago. Women into Construction are now a not-for-profit organisation, independent, and we support women wanting to build careers in the construction industry, but also working closely with construction companies that want to increase gender diversity within their organisations. So since we began in 2008, we've trained more than 2,000 women and supported more than 1,000 of these into employment. We've expanded over the years. First of all, we worked across London and then up into the West Midlands. And now we're working pretty much across the UK, from Newcastle in the north, down still in London and the West Midlands, and down through East Anglia and the south, and across to Bristol and Wales. And we work actively with over 100 construction companies at any one time. I suppose just to say, in our early days, we were challenged about whether we should even be encouraging women to go into such a difficult industry. But our feeling is that it's also a very exciting industry with lots of possibilities and opportunities for growth. And women should have the opportunity to be part of that. And we recognise that there needs to be cultural change, and an important part of the work we do involves working with companies to address this. So that's it. I mean, I can, if you want any horror stories about sexism in construction, I can.
We're coming to those.
Okay.
We're coming to those. Thank you, Kath. Thank you, Sue, for those introductions, and we'll be expanding on a bit more your work and how that's relevant to changing not only the demographics and representation and diversity in construction, real estate, and the wider built environment, but also the culture and how that also needs to be addressed as well. So a bit of context, of course, around the built environment. And I tend to love throwing the statistic that's from, it's from the Office of National Statistics, where in a book called A Manifesto for Change around Access All Areas, a Manifesto for Change in TV and the Media, it's written by Marcus Ryder and Lenny Henry. And they approached the Office of National Statistics asking the question, what proportion of the UK population is white, able-bodied men, heterosexual, based in London and the Southeast. So what proportion of the UK population is white, able-bodied, heterosexual men based in London, Southeast, have all those 5 characteristics? And the way Lenny Henry describes it is that when he received the statistic, he almost fell off his chair, because according to the Office of National Statistics in 2021, the the percentage of the UK population that's white, able-bodied, heterosexual men based in London South East is only 3.1%. of the
5%,
UK population, 3.1%. And so when you look at who actually runs construction, real estate, architecture, chartered surveying, generally speaking, across the main built environment professions and trades, you'll find that is mostly white, able-bodied, heterosexual men based in London South East. And indeed, in 2022, the chair, president, CEO of REBA, the chair and CEO of ARB, 100%, one might say, of the leadership of architecture, well, were all white, able-bodied, heterosexual men based in London South East. And so when we're looking at what does it mean around women, gender and caring, I tend to say there isn't anything wrong with the underrepresented in architecture, built environment, real estate and construction. It's just that we have massive overrepresentation of one particular demographic. And so there are some specific things around underrepresentation that we need to look at. And one of the things that, of course, causes this underrepresentation is the experiences of those who come in. Now, I don't know if you have the statistics to hand, but certainly in architecture, you've got 50% at least of women entering the profession at education level. So those who, if you're not aware, architecture education can take up to sort of 7 to 10 years. There are 3 parts, part 1, 2 and 3. And you have, 50 to 60% of the demographics of those going into part 1 education are women. However, there's at every single stage, at part 2, part 3, once they're in practice, in their 30s, 40s, 50s, dropping off, and they're not reaching leadership because of the experiences that they have. So I know both of you have got some stories to tell, and so it would be really useful to hear some of the context around that. Kath, if you can share some of not only personal experiences, but those that you hear from those around women into construction.
Yeah, so I suppose my own personal experience. So when I was working as a carpenter on site, so we're talking 40 years ago here, and going into the tea room and having page 3 plastered all over one wall, and I thought, I am one very young small woman in this, I am the only woman on site, and I thought I'm not going to challenge this. So I just sat with my back to it. So I thought I don't have to look at it, and but when they look at me, they have to look at it. And actually, within a few days, it came down, and I have no idea who took it down. And actually, I found as well as sexism on site, there was also a lot of support and camaraderie. So it was really finding a balance. And I suppose for me, I really enjoyed the work I was doing. That was really important to me. So, I am very aware that there is less sexism now, and that there is less kind of overt sexism on site. There is still, there are still some absolutely awful behaviours. I did hear a shocking report of a female engineer with extensive experience in another country who was told that she was only given the job because the boss likes Asian girls, and who then made very unwelcome comments and asked her to cook for him. And then effectively, when she refused, she was pushed out of the job. And I'm afraid to say she did complain. Her complaint wasn't addressed. She was moved elsewhere. He was not, his behaviour wasn't challenged. And now I think there is, there's a lot of issues here. One that comes up is culture. So the importance of culture, company culture and support from the top is absolutely key. You will always get, the odd guy who is just, who's going to behave badly. And really there needs to be a way of dealing with that so that that kind of behaviour can be nipped in the bud. And that's where company culture is really important. So,
I
yeah.
was just going to say, I tend to quote Grunis and Whitaker 2015, who say the culture of any organisation is shaped by the worst behaviours the leaders willing to tolerate. And I tend to sort of flip that and say the culture of any organisation can be shaped by the best behaviours leaders are willing to demonstrate. And therefore, if they're tolerating that kind of poor behaviour and not demonstrating a different way of, supporting the woman who's faced those things, and not challenging the man who has perpetuated those behaviours, of course, that sort of thing is going to keep on keeping on. Kath, you were going to continue.
Well, I was going to just talk a little bit more about company culture, and we became very aware of this when we were working on the Olympic build. The ODA were keen to increase diversity and were very supportive of our work, and which meant that members of the supply chain who had often never dealt with women and just didn't particularly want to either, but they were happy to engage, and once they had engaged, had a really positive experience. So, and also since the Olympics and going on and working for many other organisations, we found that companies that have a positive approach to diversity from the top are much more likely to engage with us and also provide a positive work environment for women.
So,
yeah, asking for specific examples. I think, it has been endemic in the real estate industry for, forever. You just, when you gave that figure about, white heterosexual men from London and the southeast, and quoted those made up 3.1% of the population, I'd actually guessed it was 4%. And I think in real estate, bearing in mind that when I'm talking real estate, I'm probably really talking about surveying primarily. Although obviously within Real Estate Balance, we have lots and lots and lots of property people. We have a few architects, not enough architects. And we have certainly any number of planning consultants and number of comms consultants, lots of lawyers, and quite a few recruitment agencies. But I think it all comes down, everything is down to culture. I think that the real estate industry, whoever you were just quoting in terms of architecture, that it's 50-50 entry level. And I think I've got particular views about what happens in architecture. I think a lot of the problems in architecture occur, don't they? Because, the most successful architects, and I've worked with any number of architects over the years, are those that literally are working 24 hours a day, aren't they? And architecture, it seems to me, is probably one of the worst industries in terms of family friendly policies and all the rest of it. I think if you think about real estate mainly in relation to surveyors, there is a very particular sort of person who becomes a surveyor. And there's a bit of a sort of standing joke in Real Estate Balance now about, if you go to a lot of the big agents, for example, you will find that the senior people in a lot of the big agents are men that wear signet rings on their little finger, like, King Charles. It's actually become a bit of a standing joke now in Real Estate Balance about men with a ring on their pinky, a signet ring on their pinky, as I call it. But real estate is very, has historically been really mired in those things about, do you shoot? Do you play golf? Are you prepared to go out drinking heavily, particularly on a Thursday night? And so a lot of what we're doing in Real Estate Balance is about challenging those stereotypes, and about actually, we've got a very, very, very lively Next Gen committee, which is very diverse, both in terms of gender and ethnicity. It's about questioning all the time what we're doing and why we're doing it. And just as an example of stuff that I've got going on, sort of at the moment, this morning, I've been at a meeting of our network of networks, because we chair something, and it's chaired by a chap called Clarence Dixon, who's a Black American chap who's in charge of D&I for CBRE from across Europe, and he chairs it. And we had a session this morning, and it was actually led by the head of diversity and inclusion at CBRE, who was talking about the very sophisticated arrangements they've got now across all of their networks and how they'll work together. And then, I mean, tomorrow, for BizNow, who's obviously one of the big publications, are running a big event in the morning, 600 women at the Park Lane Hotel, looking at issues around women in the industry. Tomorrow night, we're running an event at Savills, who are traditionally one of the posh boy agents, but have really bought into D&I in a big way. And then on Thursday night, we're running a big event to celebrate saluting our sisters, Black History Month. So, I mean, a lot of what we're doing all the time is challenging stereotypes, and, you know, looking at, we last week launched our parents network, because clearly, I mean, it's the same as architecture. In terms of the agents, for example, and most people come into property through the agents, it's 50-50 at entry level, male and female. And then what happens is, as you go up, you know, as you go up the scale, a lot of women leave and a lot of Black people leave. And why is that? Because they're just working in a culture which is not conducive to you know, I mean, often not conducive to sort of being family friendly. I think not conducive. I mean, what Kath was saying about, you know, page 3 stuff in the canteen. I mean, I don't think, you know, I don't think I've ever seen page 3 stuff at CBRE sort of canteen. But, you know, it's the same sort of principle of people behaving in a particular way, which then just, it just propagates, doesn't it? You know, people bring in people that look like them and sound like them and act like them, and that just, you know, gives a continuation of then the industry going forward. And as I say, our next gen now is really challenging a lot of those stereotypes, and there's a lot of work, I think, going on now. And there's an organisation called Pathways to Property, which is led by a really good chap called Paddy Allen, who works for Collier's on his day job, you know, which is very much about getting people into the property industry from, you know, from the sorts of background where they wouldn't normally have done. I mean, we run the biggest survey, EDI survey, in the real estate industry, which we run every 2 years. And the survey, when we did it this time last year, we for the first time asked questions about social mobility. And I mean, there's a much higher proportion of people in the property industry that went to private school, for example, than there is in the general population. And a lot of what we're doing is about raising the awareness of that stuff. It's just making sure that people are questioning it all the time, and just looking to ensure that you can get as many people from non-traditional sort of property backgrounds as you can. I mean, what's very sort of strange for me is I have a 31-year-old son who's MRICS, so he's qualified, you know, surveyor. But he's white, he's middle class, and he went to a posh school. And I say to him, Ben, you must just, oh, I'm going to cry now, because I say to him, Ben, you must hate me, because, you know, I'm representing everything that you're not. But he says, I'm so proud of what you do, Mum. No, not at all, but bless him. But believe me.
You need allies. We absolutely need allies in this work. And
yeah.
I think we need that 3.1% to recognise that they're taking up quite a lot of seats.
And I think, to be fair, I mean, I think one of the things that is happening, and a lot of it in real estate balance, as I think, whether I've said it or not yet, that we do a lot of work with CEOs, and I say you can't become a member of Real Estate Balance without signing our 10 CEO commitments. So what we have now got, certainly in Real Estate Balance, is a lot of our CEOs, and a lot of the CEOs of very senior organisations in the property sector really have bought the D&I message. And so you've got it at the top, you've got it at the bottom, or in the entry level with our next geners, and it's all the buggers in between, really, which is
I mean,
issue of
and
how
I
you
think
deal with it.
that is the interesting point, isn't it? Because I think even if we have some leadership buy-in where they are committing to charters, pledges, MOUs, commitments. And we have the next generation who are coming in. They're trying to bang that door down and facing cultures where if they're not making the progress that they want to, they are turning around as a revolving door, turning around and leaving the professions. We can't afford them to leave the built environment at all, but they're leaving our professions. So how do we, Kath, how do we tackle the buggers in between?
Well, I suppose we try to do it practically. So we work with companies. So I absolutely agree that we need allies, and it's really important to have male allies for this. So we work with companies to look at their culture and look at what needs to change. And also, I suppose, to recognise that changing the culture is good for everyone. It's not just about women. So work placement adjustments and flexibility benefit everyone and encourage and support the sharing burden of care, for instance. So, yeah. So, and our experience of companies that implement flexible working are that these opportunities are welcomed by men too. So we've done a lot of work with HS2, and when they were introduced there, they found more men took up the opportunities. And I think, that brings you on to something. So we will have, and I've been told anecdotally that if men want to take time off to go and look after their kids, they might just stick a meeting in their diary at the end of the day or something like that. Whereas women won't do that, but also probably wouldn't get away with it on a regular basis. So if a woman is taking time off, she's more likely to be thought, okay, well, she's more committed to her family than work. And that can be a bit of an issue as well. So, so women can then be seen to be less committed. So, yeah.
There are a number of, I would recommend when we're looking at trying to change culture, there are four things I tend to say around. The first is behaviours. How do we shift the behaviours? Because the main thing being that we can implement policies, procedures, and practices. We need to create, implement, and enforce the policies, procedures, and practices that support women. So when we have, for example, gender pay gap reporting, that we then have accountability for the fact that, for example, in construction, it's widening. Actually, not just in construction, in architecture as well, a number of other of the professions where there is reporting going on. Reporting's been going on for a number of years now, but then who is holding anyone accountable for the fact that these reporting outcomes are just getting wider and wider, and not a huge amount is changing for the women on the ground. So having those procedures, policies, and practices don't guarantee their use. It's the behaviours, motivation, etc., to do so. But then how do you promote the behaviours? And I've got a couple of books that I've brought along to share around some more insight around this. And one of them is The Double X Economy by Linda Scott. And she's got this incredible line in here, which says, if the global community chose to dissolve the economic obstacles facing women, an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity would follow. And so there's something about the economics of the situation that needs to be tackled. How can we actually hold businesses economically accountable for then supporting those policies, procedures, and practices? So to your point, Kath, around the unpaid care. Unpaid care falls on women because they are paid less, and therefore it's seen as less of a family sacrifice for them to be working less, and therefore they have to look after mum and dad, they have to look after the kids, have to look after any other caring needs within a family, and so the economics of that system doesn't support women therefore being promoted, supported through the reproductive necessity to continue the human race. I tend to say that if we could give men the job of gestating babies, I'm sure many of us would, but I don't think we can. At least that's not the case at the moment, that, you know, women as a part of the human race have to gestate children. And so, you know, that is it's not necessarily a choice systemically for women to be able to do so. So these kinds of things, to be able to support women through then the biological outcomes of that, menstruation, menopause, other reproductive health things, how do we then create the economic imperatives and incentives to help organizations around being more inclusive of women? Sue, solve that.
Well, I mean, it's I'm going to say it's insoluble, but I mean, you know, I mean, ultimately it can't be insoluble. But I mean, one of the things I think, I mean, the gender pay gaps thing is incredible, isn't it? But, you know, having said that, I mean, we spend a lot of time and effort and energy at Real Estate Balance looking at data, because, you know, we take the view that you can't change what you can't measure. And so I think the gender pay gap in that sense, the reports, although they're, I think they're really quite frightening. And I think the most recent gender pay gap information isn't it, that education actually has bigger gender pay gaps than any other industry. And then I think the next two up are construction and financial services, and where real estate falls in that, I don't know. But I mean, you know, for all the fact that it's incredibly disconcerting that in spite of the fact that we've now got gender pay gap reporting, there's not been any improvement. But I do go back, what you can't change what you can't measure. So I think we have to continue reporting on that stuff. I mean, in terms of the more sort of general economic arguments, certainly I think what sort of more sophisticated real estate organisations are doing now, and I happen to have been at CBRE this morning, and I have to say they are really quite forward thinking now. I mean, they're quite forward thinking. I think a lot of the agents are now. The big accounting firms, you know, PwC in particular, are very good at this. And I think a lot of the lawyers are doing this. But I mean, CBRE, for example, now, adherence to D&I policies and principles and what you're actually doing in terms of the D&I space is now becoming part of the remuneration, you know, part of your remuneration. And that if you're not sort of adhering to D&I policies, or you're not involving yourself in the D&I debate, you just don't get paid as much. And that is clearly, I mean, that sounds very, I mean, that's, you know, the way I've just described that is fairly brutal. But I think, you know, it has to be considered, doesn't it, that if if you're in an organisation and you're being paid very well, as for example a lot of the agents will be, you know, you're obviously paid on what you're bringing, what work that you're bringing into the organisation and what work you're doing. But equally now, a lot of these big agents, for example, if you don't buy into the D&I policies of the organisation, if you're not participating in D&I work within your organisation, you just don't get paid as much. And I mean, it's not the primary thing that's going to determine your remuneration, but you know, the more companies that do that, that make that part of, you know, their remuneration package, I mean, all power to their elbow. I think that's the sort of thing you've got to be doing, isn't it?
I'd agree. I think anything financial seems to be a particular driver at the moment. There are different ways to motivate people, of course, and motivation is one of the key areas to try to bring about, you know, this kind of change. So you have intrinsic motivators, extrinsic motivators, and the self-efficacy piece. Are people actually confident enough to step up and step out and take the actions that they need to in order to be inclusive in an intersectional way, not just of women or race particularly. In your work, Kath, what have you seen as a really good motivator to try to encourage people to change?
Yeah, well, targets. So, the construction industry is driven by targets. Everything is target driven. So, I've given talks to the 3.1%, the directors of various organizations, and, and you speak about the the benefits of diversity, the economic benefits as well, and at the end the question is, so what's our target? And if they've got a target, then they're much more likely to focus around it. So we have found that, and so targets actually have really helped us. For instance, working with various local councils, so they might have a big build in their area and have specific targets, not necessarily around women, but around employing local people, around training local people, and very much benefiting the local community. And we can then kind of go in and say, all right, we can help you with those targets and bring you a group of women. So I suppose the other thing is that the industry is very practical, and very solutions focused. So we have found that going in with a solution is, that we're welcomed. So the Section 106 agreements for various builds are usually agreed by the tier 1 contractors, and then all of them pushed down to the supply chain. And the supply chain don't necessarily have a clue how to deliver on them. And so we will go in and then say, okay, right, we can help you do this, engage with us. So so that works really well for us.
It's a really interesting point about legislative levers as well. What can drive that motivation? So not only the targets, but you talk about Section 106. So the social value and building in social value into the work, and looking at not only how can we improve the economics of a particular area, but who is being brought into various sites as well. I've often wondered as well, quite recently, whether health and safety legislation could be a driver, especially in construction, because literally if people feel unsafe because of the way that they're being treated, are they going to perform well? And actually, this week is Inclusion in Construction Week in the US, and there's some useful videos and things, one of which is around a culture of safety and how helping people feel safe also encourages safe behaviour on site. And so that could be another driver that organisations can be looking at. How can they fulfil health and safety legislation through creating safe, psychologically safe environments for a variety of people to work in? Sue, you do a lot of measurement as well. So can you just explain a little bit more about what can be measured, how it can be measured, and how that can be a driver to motivate people to change?
Yeah, well, I mean, when the original 7 women set up Real Estate Balance in October 2015, they decided that they wanted it to be an empirically based organisation. So they actually set up their first survey, which they set up in autumn 2016, which reported early 2017. And then they've done them every 2 years since. I mean, we did the most recent survey this time last year. And we're now planning our next survey, which we will do this time. We will do. Sorry, we did our most recent survey this time last year. We're now starting to plan for our survey, which will take place next year. And that survey operates at 2 levels. We send it can basically be completed by any organisation working in the real estate industry. But obviously, I mean, what we're looking to do is it's getting our members really to sign up to it. And one of the pieces of work that we're doing at the moment in relation to our 10 CEO commitments is trying to ensure that CEOs in their organisations make sure that they complete our survey. And so we do an employer survey, and then we quite separately do an employee survey. And one of the most interesting, and that's all about, I mean, it started off being all about gender, you know, how many people have you got in the organisation, how many of those are women, etc., etc. But in 2020, we started asking questions about race for the first time. And then last year, we asked questions about social mobility for the first time. And we basically asked questions based on you know, standards set down by the Social Mobility Foundation. And that's where we discovered that, you know, a very large proportion of people work, a much larger proportion of people working in the real estate industry were privately educated than the general population. So those are the things that we're really looking at and that we ask. I mean, at one level, I mean, it's really depressing because, I mean, basically the survey we did this time last year showed that in fact, there'd been hardly any improvement in the number of executive women employed in the real estate industry, because obviously what's happened is, you know, companies have been put under a lot of pressure to put more women on boards and things. So you've obviously had a background of, you know, a lot of non-exec women being appointed to boards and things. Now, I mean, I've got to be a bit careful what I say here, because, you know, I've got a number of non-exec women on my board, but I mean, I genuinely believe that you only really make progress when you're actually making sure you've got an improvement in the number of exec women employed in an organisation rather than non-execs, because, you know, non-execs can be brought in. I mean, executive women, clearly it takes longer because you're, you know, we've already talked about, you know, the fact that entry level, it's all 50-50, and then women fall out partly obviously because of childcare issues and things, but I think they equally fall out because of some of the cultural issues that we've been talking about, you know, and that is, as I keep saying, that's the thing which we're really concentrating on now in real estate balance, is what cultural change do you have to make sure that you can get women to the top, and yeah, how do you do that? So we're absolutely sort of obsessed by all of that. I mean, going back, I mean, Kath was talking about, you know, being sort of measured on things. I mean, clearly, one of the things we quote all the time is all the work that's been done by McKinsey, which show that more diverse organisations are more successful organisations. I mean, I always say that, I mean, it seems to me that it's a moral imperative. I don't think you can exclude anyone from any organisation based on their gender or their race or their social background. But I mean, I think I'm probably a bit idealistic on that sense. And so there's, you know, there's a lot,
it's not
lot
just
now,
idealism.
about business case, isn't there? That, you know,
yeah,
a lot of people want a business case made to show that actually you've got to have diverse organisations in order to you know, to succeed.
Talk about the business case. I mean, obviously, I tend to say, show me the business case for the status quo, and actually there isn't one. So, however, there are 30 years plus of research going into the benefits of not only a diverse organisation, but you need to have an inclusive culture as well. And one of the things is I'm currently writing the book, A Practical Guide to Inclusion in Architecture and the Built Environment, and I've had both of you been very kind in finding some great case studies for that. And all of those case studies show that you can run built environment organizations differently, have a very productive and happy workforce, and you're starting to mop up work where other people are starting to struggle. And these diverse and inclusive organizations aren't struggling in current economic times in the same way as some more traditionally run businesses are. So it might just be that the economics more generally are going to take care of things. Just to your point about boards, Sue, that the Financial Conduct Authority published a policy last year on diversity and inclusion on company boards and executive committees, introducing new listing rules to require issuers to include a statement in their annual financial report setting out whether they have met specific board diversity targets. And it was a meet and comply or explain basis. So setting targets on a comply or explain basis for the representation of women and people from minority ethnic backgrounds is designed to be a positive reporting benchmark to encourage progress. However, it serves as a starting point to encourage scrutiny and consideration of diversity and inclusion more broadly at both senior levels of listed companies and throughout their businesses. And this is for listed companies, obviously. However, obviously, if we've got larger companies in the built environment sector following through with that, we might see more role modeling occurring where we can see wider, more strategic and structural and cultural change. There is a question. If you have any questions for Kath or Sue, please pop them in the chat. We've got a question. Is there any monitoring or review of built environment companies in terms of gender pay gap? Who calls them out in the sector? Is there any built environment body focusing on this? My understanding is at the moment, the only calling out that's happening is really in trade press. So, for example, in architecture, the Architects Journal would list those who have chosen to either voluntarily or mandatorily report it, and then put them in a table, and you can see what kind of progress or not those organisations of more than 250 staff have made in term from 1 year comparatively 1 year to another. But then once they're called out in the press, that's about it. The Joint Institutes, Built Environment Joint Institutes Memorandum of Understanding, which is REBA, RICS, CIOB, ICE, Landscape Institute, and who have I forgotten? Can't remember.
Yeah, but we know you mean, don't we?
Yeah, they their data analysis action plan points don't specify the gender pay gap, but of course one of the ones due to be addressed later around standards and culture, and so one would hope that when you have a good inclusive culture, you have a mix of people throughout an organization that addresses the gender pay gap. And I have to say, I'm really excited about my remuneration fair pay example going into my book. A construction firm called Grattan Construction, based in Derby, I recently set up. They do not have a gender pay gap at the moment for their staff because of the way that they're approaching how to address pay. Are there any questions for our panelists? Rebecca's put some links into the chat for anyone wanting to have a look at a couple of the things that have been referenced. What actions can people take, Kath, around trying to encourage gender inclusion in the workplace?
Okay, so we have honed a series of positive action programs, and we work very specifically with companies on specific bills in order to make those happen. So they're quite short, and we work backwards from the job opportunities. So we'll typically work with a single company or a group of companies on a project and find out what opportunities they have available. And from there, we will build a program. So if it's a particular type of opportunity, we'll recruit to that type. So for instance, the Home Builders Federation are looking more for project managers. We had one program that we ran with Lang O'Rourke, and they were looking for concrete and steel fixers. So very different types of programs. and we run more general ones as well. And so from there, we have no problem recruiting women for the programs because they can see that there are opportunities and real outcomes. So we then get a group of women, usually around 15, sometimes more, sometimes less, and we will put them through an initial training program. So a lot of these women will come either with degrees or with having already, got a craft qualification, and we will put them through the CSCS card and give them some kind of basic confidence training. And then they do a 2-week work placement on site. So the program itself is effectively only 4 weeks long. But then at the end of those 2 weeks, we will go back to the contractor and say, okay, right, you said you had job opportunities. You've had a chance to actually explore what this woman, can do for you on site. What's the chance of giving her an opportunity? And we find we get up to 70% conversion on that. So those have been really great. And also, it can be really daunting for a single woman to go into a very male-dominated environment. And this is a way of the women actually support each other, and they have support from us. So this is a way of them actually being able to go forward. And also because construction is a kind of ever-moving feast, and it's really important that it has to be quite a fast program to be able to kind of keep up with the build and at the different stages of the build. So we have found our positive action programs to be really good. And the other thing they do, I suppose, is to educate the contractors who are maybe not used to taking on women. And so it's a way of engaging. So we're not saying you must give these women jobs. We're saying, please offer them a work placement and consider them for the jobs that are available. And it gives them a chance to actually work with the women and to actually see that, well, I suppose deal with unconscious biases and see that actually the women are good, they're keen, and they've got a lot to contribute.
Thanks. And I think there's a really important point there that sometimes the prejudices that people have about women, certainly in construction, are based around their ability to kind of do a role, regardless of whether they've ever seen anyone in action, and maybe looking as well for those who don't necessarily conform, which they probably haven't seen that either. Rebecca's put a question in there about flexible and part-time working for women in the trades, and whether it's easier to be flexible and part-time in the trades than it is in the professions. What's your view on that, Kath? Because ultimately, until we can sort out the more societal issue of the burden of unpaid care being placed on women, women are going to be more often than not doing the part-time work. So is it true that women are more likely to be able to be part-time flexible if they're in the trades than in the profession?
No, is the short answer. Certainly not in mainstream. So it feels that it is more inflexible in trade areas than in more office-based areas. I suppose one of the important things that women into construction, that I felt that the women into construction could do, was to get women working in mainstream. So in my experience, women who train in the trades often end up being self-employed because they can't get into mainstream. But there are also, some of the women that really suits them, others not so much. So I suppose it's about being able to do what is best for you. So the women that I know who have a good work-life balance and are able to work flexibly are self-employed, and and therefore in control of their own hours. but there are absolute disadvantages to that as well. So no, it's working more than full time in mainstream.
Yes, and I completely misrepresented Rebecca's question as well, because she said it completely the other way around. Sue,
I was going to say, can I come in on that? Because
yeah,
the question that Rebecca's asking there, I imagine it's easy in the profession. Sue may disagree. I mean, the one thing I think that happens in the professions is that, and it's all around me. I mean, my chair of Next Gen is actually a lawyer, and she works officially 4 days a week. But I mean, she's inevitably still working on a Friday. And I think what happens in the professions, if you want to call it that, is that, yes, in principle, women can work part-time or choose their hours. But in practice, what happens is that people are not only, they may be choosing to work 3 or 4 days a week, but I bet your bottom dollar, they're actually working 5 or 6 days a week. So I think that it's, perhaps, obviously, if you're in a trade and you're actually working on site, then, you are constrained by how many hours of daylight there are and, sort of weather conditions, all that sort of thing. The thing is that I think when you're working in one of the professions, if that's what we're calling them, if you are a real estate lawyer or you're a planner or you're an agent, you can, if you're not careful, just continue work all the time, because there's no restriction on you in any physical sense of what you can do and when. So I don't disagree actually with what you're saying, Rebecca, but I think it's not always a good thing, because I think there's quite a lot of women probably who work part-time that are doing part-time plus and actually not being paid for it.
Yes, and I think that's probably the danger. I think ultimately, when it comes down to, I'm quite aware of time, how women can be progressed and supported in the trades and professions across the built environment. I think we've all recognised that the issue really is one of culture, and culture is informed by behaviour, certainly from leadership, but we need for the younger people in professions to keep on pushing at that dawn. So we have both a top down and a bottom up in the hope that we might squeeze, dare I say, to use your term, Sue, the buggers in the middle. And how do we do that? Well, certainly it's rooted in how can we motivate, and we've talked about some of those motivations around targets, around legislation, around providing those solutions. And there are organisations like, of course, Real Estate Balance and Women into Construction, and a number of the other organisations that are part of the network from Building People that do provide some of those solutions that are handed literally on a plate to organisations to help them with supporting some of that cultural change. Any kind of the knowledge that you might need to support that cultural change can be found through various CPD methods. The Supply Chain Sustainability School do a great deal of CPD for those organisations that are signed up to that. And of course, we provide insight and guidance here at Building People as well. And then planning, being really clear about how you plan and you strategize and you put these things into place in a very meaningful and targeted way to address those policies, procedures and practices, and then actually actioning those policies, procedures and practices, going back to those motivations in order to do so. So it is possible. It's just a case of being able to motivate in the first instance to bring about those change, and things like seeing those big organizations do so as a result of using those other levers like the Financial Conduct Authority and so on, levers to be able to encourage a kind of role modeling and seeing the bottom line turn around as well, is one of those reasons. We're going to continue to talk about different dimensions of diversity. Coming up next month, we're talking about race, ethnicity and religion and LGBTQIA. And in December, looking at generations and young people. Currently, we have 5 generations in the workplace. And so how do we manage the cultural differences there? Please look on Eventbrite and search how to talk about and building people for that. Thank you very much indeed to Planning Portal for sponsoring the series. And if you'd like to get in touch with our panelists, you can do so. Sue Brown at Real Estate Balance, Kath Moore at Women into Construction, and Rebecca has put those details into the chat. Thank you all for attending, and please keep in touch with us here at Building People for this and more insight around diversity, equity and inclusion.